So we, I think, should dive in. We have a really incredibly interesting, geeky, sort of essential conversation to have tonight, which is about zoning. So I'm kind of thrilled to have these speakers with us tonight. So I think what we'll do is similar to other ones. Kristy and then George will talk, and then I'll kind of sum things up. And then I want everyone to really be listening and taking down notes, because we'll have a lot of time for Q&A and discussion with the speakers. So we'll have plenty of time for that. So our first speaker is Kristy Senatori, who's the acting executive director of the Cape Cod Commission. Kristy was appointed to the position of acting director of regulation and planning agency of the Cape Cod Commission in January of this year. At the beginning of February, Ms. Senatori started working for the Commission in 2008 as the Chief Regulatory Officer overseeing regulatory programs, and she promoted as Deputy Director in 2012. She graduated with a Bachelor's of Arts degree from Hamilton College in New York and a Juris Doctorate degree from Vermont Law School. She worked in the private sector for several years before joining the Commission staff, and a few of her specialties were the Commission for Management, Communications, Economic Development, and Strategic Information Programs. So Kristy, I'm really excited to have Kristy here tonight. And then before she comes up and talks with us, our second speaker, George Proakis, is Director of Planning for the City of Somerville. Over 15 years of experience in diverse projects. His experience in community master planning, transit-oriented development master planning, innovative land use regulations, form-based codes, historic preservation, and economic development. His years of experience include project solicitation, project management, data analysis, collaboration with master plan and developments. The planning division in Somerville under Proakis is overseeing and seeks to develop more and better community-focused spaces with preserving character of Somerville and incorporating the vision residents have for their neighborhoods. They're pursuing these goals by administrating and implementing Summer Vision, the comprehensive plan for the city, which she'll talk about, and addressing the city's goals, policies, and actions through 2030. Summer Vision and the neighborhood planning projects are helping understand the needs of residents while their zoning code aims to keep developing aligned with long-term planning goals. And they're currently going through a rezoning process in Somerville. So those are our two speakers tonight. And remember, take notes. There'll be lots of questions in there. So
Kristy will wind it up, right?
Yeah, and I'll sort of try and summarize this at the end. So I'll be the last speaker. Everyone knows what
Thank you. It's always nice to introduce as a keynote speaker. But given the topic, zoning to meet the needs of the future, I wanted to try to make it a little bit more engaging and exciting, so I'll try not to use the zoning word too much. But what I wanted to see if I can make this work.
issues already.
But I am from the Cape Cod Commission. How many are not familiar with the Cape Cod Commission? Perfect. So we are the regional planning agency for Cape Cod. So what I wanted to focus on was the Cape Cod Commission's role in zoning on Cape Cod and how what we do fits into the conversation that you're having around National Conference. So what I wanted to do was really talk about three main things. The first is our regional policy plan. So this is a plan that guides growth and development for the Cape that is set by the Cape Cod Commission. It's an ordinance through Hartsville County. Most people know of it as our regulatory ordinance for managing and guiding developments of regional impact, or DRIs, but it's also a very large planning instrument. I also wanted to discuss briefly our regulatory review in large projects, and then how we, as a commission, offer technical assistance to communities as they move forward with planning. Did that right? Okay. Sorry. Do you want me to help just come over here? Get to stand up.
Can you speak up a bit?
I sure can. So the first thing is our regional policy plan. We are in the middle of updating our regional policy plan. This is a document that is really important for the work that we do at the Commission, and the changes that we're making right now are really going to set the stage for planning and growth and development on the Cape for at least the next 5, potentially even 10 years. So the way we're looking at updating the regional policy plan is really taking a look at how can we as a regulatory agency streamline look at expediting permitting for the projects that we do look at. And how can we incorporate additional types of housing into our planning and development projects that we look at. We're also looking at easing the local comprehensive planning process and incorporating capital planning and capital infrastructure into the regional policy plan. So those are the 4 main areas of focus of our regional policy plan that we're working to update right now. The growth policy that is set forth in the regional policy plan is really guiding growth and development to areas with adequate and appropriate infrastructure and away from areas that need to be protected or preserved for a variety of reasons, primarily historic reasons or natural resource reasons, any other cultural reasons where we would need to make sure that additional development can take place. So really it's a balance. We need to make sure we're protecting the region's natural resources, so protecting the environment, but also making sure that we can accommodate economic progress and we can focus economic revitalization around existing centers of activity. So we've done a lot of work in the last several months and years, and what we've looked at is development patterns that have taken place across the Cape and what development patterns would look like if we continue to grow in the same way we've grown over the last decade, several decades. And so this is what growth and development would look like, accommodating an additional 20,000 people over the next 10 to 20 years. This is what development would look like if we were to continue developing in the same way we've been developing. So what we wanted to do was take a look at what are some alternate scenarios that aren't necessarily increasing sprawl, that aren't necessarily increasing our infrastructure costs. So we took a look at an alternate scenario. What if we were to focus growth and development? What if we were to look at activity centers that increase density, and that where there's regulatory relief and incentives for more housing units per acre? What we found was in increasing the density in some of these areas and focusing development, it was actually more affordable to those with $100,000 household incomes. So not necessarily the affordable capital A, but really getting into that missing middle housing that we've been talking about for so long. There's less infrastructure needed, and 90% reduction in new roads. And it creates more jobs. So we're finding that looking at different ways to develop and increasing development in some of these activity centers might be the way we should look at developing in the future. So what do we really want to see in these activity centers was the next question that we asked ourselves. So we started off by thinking about what are some of the ideal traits that we would want in an activity center in terms of function and in terms of form. And so we found that we wanted to look at community activities, so some of those activities that residents would be looking for. So community centers and civic amenities, places for residents to gather and places that would serve residents. We wanted to look at a business activity, so places like restaurants and cafes and other businesses that would attract people to an area. And then also looking at form. And so in terms of form, they would need to be compact and pedestrian-oriented that would allow people to walk around and really create a street life, create a sense of place, provide more travel options conducive to pedestrians and bicycle access. So what we did was we set out to quantify and objectively identify these characteristics across the Cape and identify areas that would embody an ideal activity center. So this is a work in progress, but I just wanted to show you some of the areas that we've looked at and focused across the Cape. And so some of these may only have 1 or 2 of these traits, and some may have all of these traits, and some may aspire to have more of these traits. So if we look at community activity, this is really that first piece of what I was talking about. It has schools and libraries, some recreational facilities, community centers, and the like, some arts and cultural facilities. So what we did was look at areas where there are 3 or more of these community activities within a quarter mile. So what you're looking at here is downtown Falmouth, and some of these are representative, some of them are we're still working on, but this is just looking at the community activity component. We then looked at business activity. Again, we're still looking at downtown Falmouth here. And it shows that there are 16 or more business activities within a quarter mile. And then we looked at form. So we looked at several different factors and characteristics, but we really looked at form. We focused on 4 of these for form for compact development. So we looked at parcel size, building size, the amount of area on the parcel in relation to the amount of parking, in relation to the amount of parking. And then we also looked at the distance of the building to the right-of-way. And so we found that the areas where there were 30% or more of the parcels had compact form qualified for this particular criteria. So these were some of the areas that came out as the highest kind of scoring with these factors. And so if it had one factor, it really is to transform. If it had 2 of those factors, it was evolved, and then 3 were maintained. So just very briefly, for transform, these were areas where there's major opportunities for large-scale changes, and really areas that would be appropriate for, that are heavily auto-oriented, so less walkable, but areas that would still qualify as activity centers, but could potentially use some changes. The next areas were these evolve centers where further planning study would be needed, but areas where it might make sense to target incremental changes, so potentially incorporating form-based code, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail, creating some public improvements and some additional housing. And then some of these areas where it makes sense just to maintain the types of uses and form that currently exist. So these have a concentration of business and community activity already, and we can build upon some of the existing character within these areas. So this has been a lengthy process, but one that's really been helpful for us in looking at how we want to develop and what some of the policies are that we want to set so that we can tailor our regulation to what makes sense for communities and how they want to grow. So in that balance, we're looking to not only define these activity centers, but also Cape Cod is more than activity centers. We have beaches and natural areas. So how can we accommodate all of these areas as we look at growth and development patterns for the future? So because there is so much kind of in between, our beaches and our activity centers, we're looking at using a TRANSECT. So how many people are familiar with the TRANSECT concept? So certainly a few, but it's a concept borrowed from ecology. It's been pretty broadly applied to planning practices across the country. So we have taken a hard look at what a TRANSECT would look like for Cape Cod. So we've actually created a Cape Cod TRANSECT. So typically these have 6 or so zones, and I'll just go through these quickly here. Let's see, the first, and that might be a little bit tough to see here, but these are kind of what we're calling priority protection areas over on your left. Then the second zone would be kind of these more open agricultural lands. Then you're getting into the suburban development areas, and this is where you'll start to see a little bit more of the density with the activity centers, some of the character districts, and then special districts. So those special districts are more like your airports or other types of uses. And so then we've even gone a little bit further in looking at subcomponents of these different TRANSECT categories. And there are commercial, industrial, and residential suburban districts. And then the activity centers that I mentioned earlier with the maintain, evolve, and transform. And then those special character districts, we're looking at historic areas and maritime areas just because those are so distinct and unique to Cape Cod. And just kind of highlighting those activity centers that we were looking at really is, it's one of the key components of what we're looking at in looking at different types of urban intensity. So what this is helpful for us as we're, as regional planners, is looking at a one-size-fits-all type of regulatory approach or development pattern really doesn't respond to the context in which the development is located or should be located. So this has been a good exercise for us in that new regulatory approach. So this is the framework or part of the framework for the new regional policy plan. It's really helping us look at development that responds to the context in which it's located. And it's also helping us as we look at form-based code. So the regional policy plan focus is certainly around activity centers with the infrastructure planning and additional funding, making sure appropriate resources are available for infrastructure, the commission providing support for planning and design, and then the adoption of form-based code in some of these activity areas. So I know George is going to spend most of his time discussing form-based code, so I don't want to go into too much detail about this, but really just highlight some of the differences or the reasons why we may want to consider this approach for not only Mashpee but other areas across the Cape. Conventional zoning really just a set use, so the density form is a little bit less of a focus, and when you're looking at form-based code, it really is focused on the form and the scale of development, with the streets, the public spaces, and the uses being the secondary. So the context is certainly key here. And so what we found that some of the areas that are appropriate is where we need to create a place. Areas where compact, walkable neighborhoods are desirable. Some of those activity centers across the Cape. And more so, some of the aspirational activity centers. So areas that may only have one of those characteristics that may, potentially the community might want it to grow into an activity center. So what I wanted to discuss, kind of switching gears a little bit, is other types of technical assistance that the Commission has provided to communities. And we have a number of tools that are available in our legislative act, and one of which is a DCPC, or a District of Critical Planning Concern. And so what a DCPC allows is a community to take a timeout, if you will, on development. So there could be a moratorium on development. It's usually around in response to a particular concern. So for the example I'm going to mention in North Eastham, for those of you who don't know, Eastham just successfully has municipal water, which was a huge success, a huge win for the town. And with that additional infrastructure, they saw an increased development demand. And all of a sudden, they had applications coming in and developers who wanted to take advantage of this new infrastructure that they had in place, which is great in a lot of ways, but the town decided that they wanted to make sure that the planning was done responsibly. So they asked the commission to come in and provide some technical assistance, and so it gave us an opportunity to say, well, if you zoned your downtown area in this way, or you considered these different changes, this would provide a different context to that area, and could be the change that you're looking for. So they're in the process of putting some of those zoning changes on town meeting. I think it's coming up very soon. And this really is an opportunity for them to take a time out and make sure that some of the changes that they're looking for in not only their downtown area, but some of the areas outside can be realized. So this has been a great process to date, and it's really the first time that this tool has been used for economic development. So huge kudos to the town for taking this approach. They had, just to kind of show some of the successes of it, they had a Dollar General being proposed in this area. And so there were a lot of concerns that that's not the type of economic development that the town was interested in seeing. And so this was sent to the commission, and they've since withdrawn that application. And so I think that most of the town's pretty happy about that. But what we have found that this is great to look at, but looking at the core commercial area, it was difficult to have some of the conversations at the local level without looking at it in the environment. So we've been able to illustrate a lot of the zoning concepts that they're considering through the use of 3D tools. So just another kind of illustration of some of the zoning concepts and how showing that once you're able to take a picture and show that these 3D visualizations, you can see the density isn't necessarily out of scale for much of the area. So I didn't want to spend too much time on this. I'm happy to answer questions. I know George has an exciting presentation, so I thank you for your time.
Come on up, George. All right. Dive right into it.
So thank you all. It's good to be here tonight. Usually my trips to Cape Cod are in much warmer weather than today, but that's okay. I'm getting used to it. I want to provide a little bit of background on me and then kind of dive into some information about zoning and how it may or may not be relevant for things going on in Mashpee. So a lot of people kind of say, well, where did this guy come from? I'm from Massachusetts. I spent some time about 20 years ago working on economic development in places far more rural than this. I realized that I really was more interested in kind of the world of city and town planning. I went to planning graduate school and ended up studying. I did my master's thesis on researching development around urban transit systems, and then spent 7 years working in Lowell and the last 8 years or so working in Somerville. In both places, working on citywide and zoning issues. In Lowell, did a citywide, very conventional zoning rewrite, and then worked on a form-based code for one particular neighborhood. In Somerville, working on a citywide master plan and a code that goes with it that is designed to implement that plan. And I mean, I do like to kind of start my perspective in big picture. The Greek in me likes to go to ancient Athens first and sort of say, you know, we spend a lot of time when we talk about our comprehensive planning and our big picture planning saying, you know, how do we do placemaking, create greater, better, more beautiful places and make places better. And I would love to go on and talk about this, but instead I wanted to focus on a far more exciting topic this evening. Zoning bylaws and all that they mean for us. And I want to start not in Somerville, but in Euclid, Ohio, because the history of zoning has an important beginning in Euclid, Ohio. Euclid was not the first place to do zoning, but Euclid did zoning in the 1920s, and they established this basic map that separated industrial areas from residential areas. Euclid was the place where finally the Amber Realty Company that wanted to grow industry on their 68 acres of land in Euclid, but found themselves in the residential district, decided to challenge the entire concept of zoning. And in, I believe it was 1923, this fine group of gentlemen here, who were the Supreme Court at the time, determined that zoning was indeed, actually 1926, was indeed a legal way of regulating land by local governments. And the quote they used to describe this concept of zoning was that it would keep the pig in the barnyard and out of the parlor. Maybe referring to industrial uses around residential neighborhoods. So this is Euclid's zoning map today. They've got their industrial districts and their residential districts and their multifamily districts. This is Euclid today, and actually you can see their zoning has been very successful at accomplishing what they set out to do. They got their retail down here, and their single-family residential there, and their multifamily over there, and essentially it achieves what conventional zoning achieves. If you want to separate uses and you want to set setbacks as you need to, it works. So I wanted to start by sort of just looking at kind of what zoning in its most conventional, basic Euclidean style really is. And it's basically the regulation by a public entity of land use, bulk, density, dimensions, as well as a whole administrative structure for enforcing it, whether that be planning boards, zoning boards, special permits, by right uses, building inspectors, and all those things that go with it. Essentially, it regulates development within zones. Massachusetts is very particular. You have to treat similar things in similar ways in similar zones. Identifies a lot of where things cannot be built, establishes activities allowed and not allowed, and then says, here's a program for doing design review, site plan review, special permits, etc. But it has some challenges, and not that doesn't do a lot of good things, it has some challenges. It tends to emphasize use as the key way to regulate. It regulates density, but doesn't always address form or design. And then design is often either covered in the guideline or in an administrative process or a review process. And then we do this thing where we say, well, we really want more control of this and we want more control of that, and more uses become special permit over time. Or one of the popular things we did in Somerville, which is basically if we make everything non-conforming, we can send everything to the Board of Appeals, which is a very creative way of controlling things, but it creates a very arbitrary way of managing things. And then, you try to change something, and it's difficult to have the conversation of, well, what's it going to look like? What's it going to be? If I take this idea to town meeting and I say, I want to change the zoning ordinance, are they going to read it and they're going to go, well, yeah, you could do what you say you're going to do, but you could do these 20 other things too, and I don't really trust it. And then you can do the greatest zoning in the world, but you also have to fit it in with all these other regulatory pieces about wetlands and floodplains and building codes and health codes, and all of them together create what is the built environment around us on a regular basis. I want to go through the elements of conventional zoning, and I'm going to pick on them a little bit. It's not that they're the worst things in the world, it's just I'm going to explain some of the things that they can and cannot do. So you start with setbacks. Setbacks is essentially a regulation of where you can't build buildings. If you really think about it, when you say you have to have a front yard setback of 20 feet, it's saying, all right, I can't build a building in this 20 feet. I can't build a building in this space. But here's a Somerville building that meets its setbacks. It doesn't look like anything else around it, but it is within the setbacks. Then you go to floor area ratio, which this became very popular for starting in the 1960s. FAR, this concept was designed for the purpose of regulating skyscrapers in New York and saying, okay, well, if you cut out a certain amount of open space here, you can go taller. So basically what it is it's the ratio of area of floor space to area of land, right? All of these here have a 1.0 floor area ratio. The one on the left covers the whole lot. The middle one, it covers half the lot. You can go another story, so you're still the same amount of floor, and then, okay, well, I can go 4 stories if I can only cover 25% of the lot. Floor area ratio is like handing people a can of Play-Doh. And the size of the can that you give them depends upon how much land they have. The more land you have, the bigger the can of Play-Doh. And with Play-Doh, you can make very interesting building blocks. Of course, with Play-Doh, you can make a dinosaur. So you want to be careful of what you do with floor area ratio. A lot of the form-based codes folks don't like it because they're like, well, it really doesn't accomplish much when you start to do it at a smaller scale. But it's in a lot of codes. Open space, at its best, you can build the next New England town green or greenway or trail or whatever. At its worst, someone can come in and say, well, there's my open space right next to the Jiffy Lube, so I'm using it for drainage. Parking requirements. The average American parking requirement seems to have gotten us to the point now where we devote more land area to parking than we do to building. And then, now usually in Massachusetts, we step out of zoning into subdivision regulations and we regulate streets and we determine where sidewalks should be. In this case, I cannot figure out what they were doing with where sidewalks should be, or whether or not they should have a berm or a granite curve or how it should work or everything like that. So, you put all these regulations together and you kind of mix them up and you create the rules that create places. And then you toss on top of it use regulations. Now, I love use regulations because they're important, and there are very good reasons to have them. No code should go without them. In Somerville, we're going from having about 300 of them down to having about 95, which is not like they're making it disappear. But use regulations have evolved very interestingly over the years. A lot of places, they make lists of what's allowed or what's not allowed or what's discretionary allowed. I'm going to use an example from one code in California that had a one district where they listed all the uses were allowed. And you can try to get an idea of how over time this use code sort of evolved. There were 19 Turkish baths, 25 blocks of arena, 28 chinchillas retail sales. On wholesale retail. All right. There are 41. Here's the first rule of zoning ordinances. You can create a word that people don't understand. Use that instead of one that they can't. Does anybody know what that means? It means charitable institutions. But why use a simple word when you can use a complicated one? Number 42, embalming business. Number 95. This, by the way, this code has no definition section for its uses. So if you can figure out what number 95 means, you can potentially do it. So along came someone who wanted to manufacture potato chips. But understand, now if they want to expand into corn chips, they're going to have to go back to get a zoning amendment to add it to the list of allowed uses because we defined it so narrowly, right? So you can do your embalming and your tombstones in this district. So maybe there was like a cemetery nearby. In this community, I don't know exactly what it was about this community, but number 135 proves they really liked their turkey. So you get into this thing where you're like, okay, I'm all about uses and I'm really tied to this concept and here's what I want to do. And then you start going, well, I don't know if I want that use or don't want that use. And inevitably what communities do is they push towards the solution to all zoning problems, the special permit. Well, I'll just make it special permit and then we'll be able to have a conversation about it. We'll set up rules for determining whether or not we should approve a special permit. Now, tonight I'm picking on your zoning ordinance, not that there's anything particularly different about it than any others. These are some of Mashpee's rules of determining whether or not something should generate a special permit. I usually use the ones from Somerville, but I figured since I had the code in front of me, I'd put them up there. The challenge of this is they're all important things to ask about and talk about and decide what you've got to do about. But it's really tough to determine whether one thing or another thing is going to impact this or impact that. At the end of the day, we've got 100 angry residents about this issue and nobody about that issue. You've got to sort out what you're going to do with it. The challenge is, at the end of the day, you struggle with what you end up with. So if you actually look at communities in New England and kind of what we're like, there are a lot of traditional small walkable centers. I believe that's Chatham. That's Melrose. You've got the town hall. This is Needham with the little cupola on the roof and everything. Here's Portland, Maine, a little more dense, but still a walkable community. And when you try to replicate that, a lot of conventional codes are struggling to do that. And there's special permits about parking rules and everything else are struggling to do that. So here we have retained the New England cupola. It's right there. But we have lost just about everything else about this. Or we have maintained the corner store, but now it has an 80-foot curb cut and a blow-up Santa Claus in front of it. Or we have maintained the office building, but it is in its surrounding parking lot. And then you go to the things that may be the greatest need in the community, like multifamily housing, but you struggle to fit it in. You get one or two of these coming in, and then the next time someone proposes multifamily by special permit, you're like, well, I don't know, I don't trust that. I'm really not sure I want another one of those around. Or somebody tries to do the first townhouse. I call this the townhouse without a town. It's devolved from the town. And so at the end of the day, you get a lot of circumstances where the code can do what the code can do. It can regulate into single-family houses. So you can get a lot of kind of the conventional cul-de-sac development or stuff like that, which many communities may say, okay, well, for this area or that area, we might want some of that or not want some of that, or but at the end of the day, more and more frustration happens when more and more development happens. And I think one of the challenges is, if you keep on kind of plodding along on a development pattern, people look at every new development as a net negative for their community. It's like, oh, here comes another development. They're building another subdivision behind me. They're building another strip mall over here. Oh, this is just... And then you start coming out to the special permit hearings and saying, I don't want any more of this stuff. And then suddenly you end up with the not in my backyard, or what I call the cave people, the citizens against virtually everything. They're like, all right, what's the next thing they're going to propose, and how can I be against it? And I think that in many ways, it's not that conventional zoning doesn't work for some places. It's just that it becomes more challenging to try to have the community conversation about where we want to go. I can be a little bit more bold. I can quote Chuck Marone's blog, where they said to say conventional zoning is cookie cutter is unfair to the cookie industry. So a little bit about the form-based code, as an alternative or as a strategy to potentially use in zoning, it is a little bit different. One of the things it does differently, as Kristy was talking about, it puts form as a bigger portion of the code than it would otherwise be. Imagine each of these boxes is like the number of pages in your bylaw that's set for something, right? Conventional zoning forms the little box, and use is the big box. There's still use, there's still management rules, there's still special permits, there's still process, there's still all that stuff the code's got to have, but form just becomes a bigger piece of what you're looking at. You try to define a place, you create a place, you focus on form instead of density and use. You emphasize mix of uses where you can. You pay greater attention to streetscape design, public realms, so you have sort of a predictable understanding of what you're going to get. And if you do it right, and this is still challenging, if you do it right, the upfront public participation can allow creating a code that limits the need for going back for a review, for a zoning review, or a planning board review for every single individual little thing you do. Some communities still like to hang on to some of that stuff, but if you can get to the point where you can potentially do it. The key is, though, you can't do it without having a vision of what you want to do. The toughest thing in the world is to write a form-based code if you don't know where you're headed, like what you're doing. So there's a lot of importance to community visioning, but if you can get that together, the public can see what's going to happen where, you can reflect the diversity of architecture within the community, you can codify sort of the DNA, kind of the creation of a neighborhood, and hopefully you can write something that's concise, organized, and written for non-planners to understand. I'll say that I believe in Somerville we hit 2 out of 3 there. If anybody wants to look at our 600-page draft that's on our website, not sure we hit concise, but we got written for non-planners to understand, and I hope that other places will not be quite as... We regulate a lot in Somerville, but that's another story. Reducing the need for design guidelines because you can replace them with regulations and it's embedded in the code and it covers it that way. They're documented differently. The stuff on the left is all the stuff I was talking about, the setbacks, the open space. These things are a little bit different, but they're really not that scary at the end of the day. There's a lot of things about them that are very similar. Form-based code folks like to talk in terms of regulating plans, which can be done kind of different ways, but at the end of the day, they achieve the same goal as a zoning map. This is a really kind of radical way of doing it. This is basically a street space regulating plan. It says what happens depends upon what street the building fronts on, and when it fronts on a corner, you have to deal with each street and treat it the way it does so that you can have kind of main streets and back streets and kind of work together. This is Denver, Colorado's. It looks a lot like a traditional zoning map. It basically works like a traditional zoning map, but some of these mixed districts here along the corridors get a little bit more intense in terms of what they can do. But the key, I think, in most form-based codes is looking at having building form standards. Now, the idea here is very similar to a conventional code, and it still tells you where a building can be placed on the lot. But in addition to just setbacks, sometimes it tells you kind of how to deal with various spaces between there and the street, where to place parking. You know, this is a multifamily building that places the parking behind the building and establishes how that layout works. A lot of people talk about form-based codes as regulating architecture. Not necessarily. Architectural standards are optional. You can do them in some codes. You know, there's certain things you can, like Massachusetts, they don't let you regulate building materials in codes, so you actually can't really regulate some of the stuff that some form-based codes do. But you know, there are ways you can build some design standards to the extent that you want. It's still administered through an administrative process. I've seen people do them town-wide. I've seen people do them in certain neighborhoods. We've seen them in commercial centers, neighborhood squares, and places you want to transform, in special development districts. Kind of went through a lot of this. You know, the review occurs at the code development level so that you can simplify the review of individual projects. Variances, special permits, and site plan review can be limited or eliminated from the process if appropriate. Now, my form-based code purists will say, I should always say, oh, you don't need individual review for an individual project. Well, most of the time you don't. But there might be a case where you still do. You know, you're going to build, if you built a form-based code for a retail district around here, there are probably certain uses that you want to still bring in front of a board for discussion. It's not like it completely disappears. And then you can also say, okay, well, maybe I want an exemption from the code for this or that, and you can bring it in for review. It's really dependent upon the community's culture and kind of how it fits with the place and what people are used to and what they're comfortable with. They're being used all over in more and more places, from city or town-wide applications to new towns to downtowns to corridors, from Miami, Denver. I wrote the soon Buffalo, Buffalo past theirs. There are places in New England that have done it. You can look at the Southfield district of New England, Covington, and Rockland. They have a form-based code. Hamilton Canal and Bowles, the first one I was directly involved in. And there are a number of other places that have them. I want to highlight 4, including Somerville. But before I get to Somerville, I want to talk about a place on the other side of the country. And the reason I want to focus on Livermore, which is, yes, is in California, in a completely different world, is that I think there's something particularly interesting about Livermore's code that is relevant to kind of where we are today. Livermore did a citywide rewrite of their entire zoning ordinance. This was 2011. And they did not do a form-based code for the whole city. But they did rewrite the whole city's code. But when they did, they built in form-based districts in certain areas that they felt it was important to do. For example, this area where they had an existing strip mall that they wanted to make more walkable. So they had a vision to turn this into this. And they had renderings, they had done some plans, they knew where those plans were going to go. And they converted this plan into this code. And this goes back to the TRANSECT districts. There's 4 of different levels, Main Street neighborhood, and they're kind of laid out at different places. And basically they then built a form-based code into their ordinance for certain particular areas of their city. And they said, okay, in these areas, we want to follow these rules. And they have their own section with their own development regulations for these TRANSECT zones of T3, T4, which is basically kind of a mid-level intensity, with the idea that that intensity would be applied in a couple of key spots where they wanted things to change. And then they also kind of left this interesting little line where it says T5 and T6, and it says reserved. It's almost like they're saying, someday we're going to bring this to other areas, but not right now. And then the rest of the code is a conventional zoning ordinance. It's separate. There's development standards, and some of them apply to the TRANSECT zones, and some of them don't apply to the TRANSECT zones. And it's laid out in the code the way that they do. For example, there are frontage standards that talk about porches and stoops and forecourts and shop fronts and all the idea of kind of how you create a walkable block, and that's all regulated, but it's only regulated in those particular areas where they wanted to do the form-based code. And they have the building types, and those building types, like so, you know, here's a kind of basic house, here's a more intense apartment building. They're only in the TRANSECT zones. Once you jump out of those form-based TRANSECT zones to the rest of the code uses setbacks and all of the more typical rules of zoning ordinances in the rest of the community. So that's one kind of example of how it can be applied. Simsbury, Connecticut is another. They decided they wanted to do a mandatory code in their downtown to kind of, as that downtown changed, they did a very extensive charrette to work on this. They laid out a plan for how they wanted their downtown to evolve. And then as that evolution continued, they basically said, okay, we go from evolution to this to a regulating plan for just these couple of blocks. You know, this area up in here behind here is a pretty typical single-family home development. They said, okay, just through this main section of town, and then we want to regulate to make sure that what we get is a character of walkable streets with this height and this setup, and then this is like a building form for Simsbury. Hamden, Connecticut. Hamden in Connecticut, suburban town of 58,000 people, very similar to what Livermore did. They did a town-wide zoning change, and they sort of fit the TRANSECT zones, the form-based zones, right through like a spine through the middle of the town. So all like the purples and pinks are form-based, and then the yellows are traditional residential, or conventional residential neighborhood districts. They're single-family home, quarter-acre, half-acre, full-acre lots. And then in the area where they were doing them, they really focused on getting this is based upon the SMART code, which is very much a TRANSECT T-zone kind of concept. So it goes from natural to urban center. And through that stretch, they basically then created building forms. This is their use tables. They still have the use table. It's still pretty intense, but it's more simplified. One of the other things that's nice about Hamden's code, and we've tried to carry in Somerville as well, is even in our conventional section, we've tried to put more graphics in to try to just make it more readable and accessible. So there, 20 minutes in, I want to dive into Somerville and kind of what's going on with us. Now, Somerville and Mashpee are very different places in a lot of ways. Somerville is 4 square miles with about 81,000 people. We're the densest city in New England. And the character of our city is very well known as kind of rows of 2- and 3-family houses. This is our kind of focus on what we want to conserve in our neighborhoods. And then a lot of people know like Davis Square and our kind of mixed-use districts that are walkable. This has a red line transit station at it, so we're just outside of Boston, and we're very much in the intense urban center. Somerville has its share of challenges. One of our share of challenges is economic development. I love this picture because this describes the biggest financial challenge that Somerville has. There's an office building, there's a triple-decker. I did not Photoshop this. That is the city line, right? The office building's in Cambridge, the housing's in Somerville. We do the housing for everybody else. And we're trying to grow housing, but we're also trying to grow commercial development at the same time because it's important to us to be able to kind of balance our tax base. Somerville passed zoning right around the same time that Euclid, Ohio did, 1925. I wish I brought with me, it's like a little 25-page booklet. It's very cute. By 2014, we were up to about 400 pages of cross-references that I cannot even understand. And we decided we wanted to kind of go back and start from scratch. And we have done in Somerville a lot of community planning process leading up to this. This is one of our neighborhood shreds. But the key issue is we built the Summer Vision citywide plan in 2012, which runs from 2010 to 2030, which talks about job growth and housing growth and 125 new acres of open space and getting more people and walking, biking, and transit. But I think the key thing to Summer Vision and to Somerville's planning, which is very similar to the Cape Cod discussions, and I think some of the discussions that a lot of places are happening, is the future is about not stopping growth or starting growth, but about where to grow and where not to grow. And in Somerville, one of our biggest challenges is our neighborhoods of 2 and 3 family houses. We're seeing a lot of very intense growth right next to them. And that may be very different than another community that's saying, well, our open space is seeing a lot of development right next to it, or the areas that were really critical for the purpose of whether it be water recharge or groundwater, whatever it may be, are very critical. But in our case, it was the areas in green. And the idea was those areas really need to be conserved. And in our case, what we're conserving is this. In other cases, it's completely different things. But we said our goal here is to conserve the areas to conserve. We had enhanced areas, which are our squares and our corridors, where we could see things changing. And then we had areas we want to transform. Now, one may say here, okay, well, the area we want to transform is an area right around Mashpee Commons or something like that. Here in Somerville, we are dealing with sort of single-story industrial districts that are now right next to transit or forthcoming transit that we could generate a lot more tax base, build more housing. I know there's housing challenges here deep in the inner core of Boston. Our greatest housing challenge is we have a lot of people who want walkable mixed-use neighborhoods. They want to be near transit. And we have about a 400,000 unit regional housing shortage. And everyone wants to, not everyone, but say 60% of the demand is for walkable transit-centered places. And we've got these places sitting here where we could do that and generate all sorts of opportunity. And if we transform this, I don't have to worry about people poking around trying to mess with the other areas. So it's really a matter of saying, okay, here's one area to transform that allows us to conserve other areas. So we've gone through and we've gone to places where like we have future transit stations coming with the Green Line extension, or where we have things change potentially able to happen, like Davis Square, where we've had zoning in place for 30 years, but almost nothing is being built around the Red Line. And we said, well, what do we want? So like Gilman Square, we've done drawings of what we want. We've tried to figure out where it can go. We want to kind of create a real square here. And then we can start building zoning off of it that creates what we want. In Somerville, we really wanted to break the entire code up and start over. You may find in other places, all right, the code in the neighborhoods is fine or it isn't fine. In Somerville, I had a lot of challenges. Although the lot size is undersized, this is a conforming house. This is a non-conforming house. This creates a series of problems for me. This is what our zoning is encouraging me to do: consolidate lots and build huge 3-family buildings. Not that anyone can do this, the economics aren't there, but the zoning code is saying to do that. The most shocking story about Somerville that we learned when we started studying our districts is in our core residential districts, the residence A and residence B, these little dark ones right here, those are the conforming lots. All 26 of them. So, and then of course I put this map up, and at the end of the meeting I get a builder who comes over and he goes, can I get a list of what those are? All 26 of them that conform with all of the dimensions, floor area ratio, height, lot area per dwelling unit, all of those. And the reason for that, the reason why we have developed this system, is because we've tried to use nonconformity as a way to push everything to the Zoning Board of Appeals and decide what we want. And it just doesn't work anymore. It's just driving us crazy. So we went and we measured and we tried to figure out what our communities are really like. And here are my interns spending their summer trying to develop and rebuild Somerville's character, measuring, okay, this is what a real triple-decker looks like. This is what the nature of our neighborhoods really are, and this is how they work. And then from that, we have built building types try to work for those neighborhoods. Everything from the cottage and the single family and the two-family house, which basically is our conserved neighborhood, to make sure that what we get there fits in the character of what it is. And then the more intense stuff that we can use, like the mixed-use building or the fabrication lot or the commercial building, which we can use in the areas that we really want to change. So here's our building type for a two-family house, and here's our building type for a substantial multi-family building. And if you really want to dive deeper into this, somervillezoning.com is our website where we have our entire code draft up. I will say it is long. One of the reasons it's long is because we decided to approach it from the perspective of a landowner or a homeowner who says, well, I'm in the MR4 district, what can I do? And they can dive into MR4 and they can get everything that they want to in that district in there. The result of that is it's very repetitive, so we end up with a code that's it's more user-friendly that way, but like the building types repeat over and over again by district in order to do that. Somerville by Design is our neighborhood planning website. It talks about all of the neighborhood plan concepts that we've got and that we've been working on for quite a while. I love talking about the general concept of what people have said about different codes, and if it works right, a form-based code is interesting because it sort of bridges the nature of people who might otherwise disagree and kind of brings them together around the plan. From a city's perspective, it gives developers a better idea of what the city wants. From a finance perspective, it provides a consistency of how neighborhood properties would be improved. This was a quote about one of the smart codes in one of the towns. The Home Builders Association of Northern California, it lays out as the easiest way to facilitate projects is to conduct and complete environmental review, establish desired land use, prescribe design guidelines, and expedite application review. So, do the design work and the planning work up front, and then tell us what you want, and we'll build it that way. We don't have to fight with you about what we're doing. But my favorite quote about one of the form-based codes was, "We can't tell if this is a radical green left-wing document or a developer-friendly architect right-wing one." So, always like that quote. Because it's kind of really a little bit of both. So, if you look at kind of achieving outcomes and like how this can actually work, it's different for everyone. It evolves. I don't think there's any pure form-based code. It's not like the world has come to the point where there's conventional and there's form-based. There's concepts in the core of what a form-based code can be that can really help in cases with a lot of communities. Long time ago, Christopher Alexander, who's done a lot of design perspective that a lot of us who work in this field have really come to appreciate, made a comment about creating certain communities that can be more walkable and provide more community space and provide great placemaking, and said, we've reached the point where we kind of know what that is. And what we're struggling with is to find the plugs to connect it to the existing power grid. There's a line, we know what the appliance is, now we need the plugs to connect to the existing power grid. And I think the appliance is the goals for the future of your community. The power grids are your planning board, your zoning board, your state regulations, your Cape Cod Commission regulations, your fire department, your rules on streets, everything imaginable that helps determine how a place actually ends up looking. If you use the form-based code as the plug, you can find ways to make that connection a lot easier. I will say it may not be just the form-based code. It may involve performance standards, a simpler use table, special districts, innovative parking solutions, easy to read documents. A whole bunch of these things come together to kind of make that happen. So, if I can kind of sum up my whole concept on this, a form-based code is a tool to achieve a desired outcome. Now, you have to know what that outcome is in order to do it. You can write a building form for a Walmart if that's what you want. I would advise you not to bother. It's not worth using the tool if that's what you want. You can pretty much do that with setbacks and parking requirements, but you can do it. It's not the only tool, but it's one of the more integrated tools that addresses multiple issues together. And if you choose to use it, it has a lot of benefits to the community, and it can code the outcome of a planning process. So if you get community consensus behind what you want, you can actually put that into a regulatory document and know that you're going to get that, and you're not going to get something else. It helps you understand the outcome in physical form. And I think rather than looking at it as something that you necessarily need to apply everywhere, because some people do and some people don't, a lot of communities concentrate on the places where you can get high value for development, where you can generate significant tax base, where you can create certain benefits for the whole community, where you can ensure that, okay, this is a place we want to focus growth, because in all these other places we want to not focus growth. and you can facilitate high-value development in the areas where it's feasible. And I say where it's feasible because if you write a form-based code for something that isn't financially marketable, just like any other code, you're not going to actually, zoning doesn't create development. It facilitates the ability to do it. It still needs to be financeable. And it has benefits to property owners. It provides certainty on development options. It lets development ideas be tested in the planning process and confidence that the neighbors will be held to the same high standards. In a lot of cases, you know, if you build or you buy on a certain block, if the block next to you has the code, you know you're following the same rules they are. So I think there's a real kind of benefit all around if you're going to use that tool. So that's my background, and that's my introduction. I'm happy to answer questions. I know I put up my question slide next, but I know Russ has a couple of things to cover first. And
Great, thanks, George.
be here.
In thinking about all of this, I kind of kept on coming back to this discussion with George and Kristy in forum, and kind of going back to this old postcard image that we've shown, you know, a few months ago, and just thinking about how the form on Cape Cod is a relatively, you know, it's a pretty elegant but also very simple thing, you know, and it's that sort of craft and tradition that over generations has come to make these places so special. So how do we resurrect that? And I think that was a question that I've been thinking about a lot going into this conversation. So I started thinking, well, how do I bring this really abstract conversation around zoning back to what's happening here and what's the future expansion of Mashpee Commons? And I thought, well, let's just look at one of these buildings that have been built recently. So the one on the right is an 8-unit kind of multi-family building. And folks walked around, maybe gone to Cape Cod Coffee and gotten a coffee in that building. Everyone should go get a coffee. So that's that building. So, I mean, how many people don't like that building? No hands. Good. The architect's in the back room, so that But so I was thinking, okay, well, looking at that, what are the characteristics of that building? If you look at a form-based code, what's it kind of made up of? You know, it's on an 80 by 110 foot lot, 80 feet wide, 110 feet deep, 3 stories. The building itself, the footprint of the building is 80 feet by about 40 feet. Average unit size is 800 square feet, give or take. 8 units, 4 commercial spaces, so it's mixed use. So we thought, okay, well, let's say that is a building type, something that we see as a character that we all enjoy. What does that stack up against with our rules right now in zoning? And this is what happens. The height, isn't allowed. This is C1, this is the commercial 1 zone. Lot size, no, not allowed, too small. Lot width, too small. Lot coverage, too much coverage. That's building and parking lot. Front setback is 0, because we've got that sort of commercial Main Street condition. The C1 zoning has a 40-foot minimum. Side setback, 0. 50-foot minimum. So that was sort of where we're stumbling here on how do we utilize our C1 or our sort of zoning locally. And then, okay, if you look at use, which is still essential, it's something, a conversation that George has already teed up, but how do we make the use work? Well, C1 doesn't allow by right for residential. So this mix of uses is not, you know, it's not something that's allowed per the zoning. And that's why we could talk about 40B and other mechanisms for how to get residential in there. And then the affordable units. There's no residential in C1, so there's no affordable units. So this is this conundrum that we're having with how do we expand Mashpee Commons in a way that's most productive for the community and for the long-term vibrancy of this neighborhood, this mixed-use neighborhood that we've been wanting to make. So going back to this image of these old sort of Cape Cod communities, how do we do this today? And I think, you know, the tools that George and Kristy have laid out, I think, are ways that we should explore further. So just before we I'd like to invite both Kristy and George up to the front, because I think I've got a question for both of them. You know, looking at sort of the expansion of Mashpee Commons, Kristy, you know, when you looked at these things called activity centers, how did Mashpee Commons in this sort of area stack up?
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and
Yeah, maybe we'll bring the lights back.
And I think as we were looking to define activity centers, there were some kind of iconic places across the Cape that kept popping to mind. And Mashpee Commons certainly came up as one of those places that we would define, just not even looking at the criteria yet, but as an activity center. So when we went through the analysis, certainly those areas that we were thinking would rise to the top did rise to the top. And Mashpee Commons certainly was one that has a lot of the characteristics of what we would define as an activity center. So looking at that, looking at some of the areas in downtown Hyannis, downtown Orleans, other areas, I showed an example of downtown Falmouth, areas that exemplify a lot of those characteristics that we'd be looking for. And it's given us an opportunity to take a look at how we regulate in those areas, and if we should regulate in those areas, and whether the mechanisms that are in place at the local level could be sufficient to make sure that the development occurs responsibly. So that led us to the form-based code conversation, and that's where if communities are able to adopt form-based code and have other mechanisms in place to provide for appropriate and adequate infrastructure, there will be opportunities to revise the way we regulate in the future.
Right. So it's interesting because the quote you put up from the Greeks is, why are we there? Like it seems like we've gotten caught in our own mess here with zoning, and we never really talk about those core ideas of creating community. And I think what you've been doing, certainly in Somerville, is how do you bring that back to a community's vision? And then how do you, by design, create a zoning around that? So what's causing this sort of re-emergence of community in the discussion of zoning?
Well, I think a number of things. I mean, I think we're in an interesting moment in history where more and more people in different generations want to be in more walkable places. The demand for it's there, but the regulatory system hasn't caught up for it. I mean, I sort of might see myself in an interesting place in that, you know, not everybody, but there's a substantial interest, both in the generation older than me and the generation younger than me. My own generation being the one that's kind of running around raising kids, a little bit less so. In kind of seeking out walkability, seeking out amenities in the places that they're living. And even if that demand is 25 or 35% of those generations, it's still not being met. It's still not what people are in the midst of building. And a lot of that is because the regulatory process sort of leaned towards where the demand was at an earlier point in time. I think that one of the things that's challenging now, and I've never quite been able to figure out why this is, you know, look, New England has a 300-year history of being suspicious of change, and that's embedded in our Congregationalist roots, right? The idea that you bring people together in a town meeting and debate and discuss what you're going to do and not make a change until a majority, or in the case of zoning, a 2/3 majority of people actually believe that they want to take that leap forward. But at the same time, I see a lot of challenging communities that just, I don't know why this is, that really sort of feel like the generation before them, or the one, you know, our Somerville ordinance is a 1920s concept with a 1990 amendment, right? The majority of the Mashpee Code, from what I can tell, is a 1971 concept that has been updated over time. You know, I feel like I sometimes have to say, you know, the folks in 1971 were no smarter than the people in this room. You know, just because they created a set of rules doesn't mean that set of rules is the right answer for the next, 200 years. It is a healthy discussion to have, to say, did we get this right? Do we have to make more changes? Certainly you can see that in that there's incremental changes in zoning ordinances all the time. One of the things I thought was very nice about Mashpee is because you've tagged every single one of them, I can see where they've changed and when. But I think there's a value in continuing to question, to say, all right, did we have this right? Is this where our community is? Is this where we want to go? And if through planning you come to the conclusion that you want to do something different, whether it is conserve areas more or grow in certain other areas more, the zoning, it isn't the only tool, but it's probably the best regulatory tool you have to be able to move that in that direction. It's just a matter of building that zoning and taking a vote in that direction.
So one more question, I think, before we turn over to the audience is, you know, so Kristy, I was pleased to see you organize it as a TRANSECT. I think George and I both, you know, long time colleagues around form-based codes have been working on that for decades. I think it's a fairly sound planning principle. I think we can talk about that more to make sure everyone understands the concept. And I think what we've, sort of hearing the community here at Mashpee talk about it is how do we make that interface between nature, the countryside, the rural aspects of the Cape, and the sort of natural resources we have interface well with development. And how do we do that in a form that still resonates as Cape Cod? And I think that's where, the previous discussion we had at the last Tuesday talk with Chuck and Joe around how we build in places that add value, both community as well as economic, and over the long term are resilient. I think, how does the zoning and how do the regulations support that growth? I think we are seeing is so essential.
I think, so the TRANSECT concept has evolved even within our own staff and looking at how to create that TRANSECT for the Cape. And I think at one point we had like 10 districts, and we really tried to focus on 6 that make sense and then some iterations in between there, because we aren't like Somerville and we aren't like a lot of the other areas where they have used TRANSECTs. And I think what you probably saw in one of those is we're looking to map some of these areas is it's difficult because it doesn't follow parcel boundaries. And so the regulatory aspect of it, there's a lot of it that it's not a sharp, bright line. So how do you regulate something that, so we have people internally that say, no, that needs to be a bright line, the line needs to be drawn along the parcel boundary so we know what to regulate. But it doesn't work like that in reality. And so you're going to have, it needs to be integrated to the extent that it makes sense to create that sense of place, and so that you can see the context of what the activity centers are and how they interact with the rest of the areas within that TRANSECT. So it's an evolving discussion. It's a difficult one, but I think it's one that will be responsible to development patterns on the Cape as we move forward to the next decade.
Yeah.
I'll just say, if the community can figure this out, we tested this a lot in Lowell when I worked there, because Lowell has sort of walkable neighborhoods like Somerville, and then Lowell has areas that are single-family homes on cul-de-sacs, and there's a lot of in-between in the city. And one of the things we realized, and you can realize it in the Cape Cod community, you can look at a T2, which is a relatively rural kind of, almost sort of pastoral landscape type place, and you can look at T4 or T5, which is more like Mashpee Commons, a kind of walkable grid of streets. And if you get to the point where you can say, okay, I want the walkable grid here, and I want the landscape here, and that's what I want, you can always build all of your regulations around that concept. And zoning is the start. One of the other things we realized in Lowell was that subdivision standards were important in that perspective as well. There's sort of the forgotten element of regulation in Massachusetts a lot of the time, but when you go to the T2, the more rural experience, you want the swales and the curves and the stuff that kind of generates and deals with stormwater in certain ways, and you want to create a place that really works from that perspective and feels that way. If you try to pick that up exactly as is and drop it into a T4, a walkable Main Street neighborhood, some of it works, but a lot of it doesn't. There you probably want a granite curved street with a parking lane and certain, a tree pit area on the side of the sidewalk and stuff like that. And you can build kind of the entire structure of how both of those places work so that they are completely different places, but they feel that they're authentic in their own way, and they allow people to kind of select where and how and under what circumstances they want to live and be. And if you want to be in a more urban area, more walkable neighborhood area, you can do that. You want to, retreat back to nature, you've got that too. But someone didn't try to move the urban street into your nature landscape, or vice versa.
So, maybe I'll take a few questions. Do I have? You win. You got the first hand up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting to me that Somerville has as its emblematic symbol the triple decker. Because if you think of Mashpee, that's not what obviously we don't have triple deckers here, but it wouldn't be Mashpee Commons that I would look at as emblematic. It would be the greenery, the rural area, the original character of the town. And so I think that's a problem. The second thing is, it would be interesting, I think, to get a map of all of Mashpee, like the one you had of Somerville, a couple of them actually, so you could see the different zones, see what is where, and look at Mashpee Commons in that context. Because what worries me is the loss of greenery in the town and the transportation issue. And it's not, when you just look at Mashpee Commons, you don't, that doesn't become obvious. You're looking at the style of houses or other kinds of land use, commercial, etc. You don't see what the future is going to look like. And I don't think, well, I think we need to look at Mashpee Commons in the larger context of Mashpee and also really discuss what is emblematic of Mashpee. Because I would guess for most people, it's not really Mashpee Commons. Maybe for outsiders it is, but if you live here, that's not what you would pick as your emblem of the town.
I certainly understand there's a lot of, I mean, that's a healthy conversation to have, especially in the middle of the charrette conversation, sort of kind of what defines and what makes your town what it is, and I think that's really important. I think that one of the challenges that we have had in our state for a long time has been that the tools to protect the rural are limited in ways that, I can editorialize a bit and say that I don't think they should be. At the same time as the tools to create the walkable spaces are challenging to build, but they're available to you if you want to use them. So one of the things that happens is, I don't remember the exact time frame and the details, but at some point in time, Massachusetts courts basically said, you really can't create lots bigger than a certain size. Most communities kind of landed on the 80,000 square foot 2-acre lot. And the 2-acre lot is challenging because it spreads houses apart, and you can do it in such a way that you kind of hide them in the woods and stuff and try to keep the rural streetscape while people are still sort of developing on lots, and kind of surround it with nature as much as you possibly can. But the reality is you create a kind of a structure of infrastructure that's very tough to maintain and manage at that size. You spread them just far enough apart that you can't really kind of create the walkable piece, but they're not far enough apart that they really feel like what you probably think of the town as, which is not houses dropped every 200 or 300 feet. It's nature, and that really isn't. It certainly isn't nature. It's not like you can farm on a lot that's 2 acres. It's like you kind of end up in this sort of in-between sprawl stage, which is really kind of difficult to deal with. And that's not unique to any community. That's a kind of statewide challenge of some sort. I try to encourage more people to sort of pull their growth in and then try to preserve more around the edges. The challenge is I'm not sure we have all of the tools to preserve around the edges that we necessarily need yet.
In looking at Somerville, what's very interesting to me about Somerville is you can only, first of all, walk so far. So what I like about Somerville is you have all these different squares. You have neighborhoods, and each neighborhood, has sort of its own little cluster going on. So people that live in these little neighborhoods, they can identify with a few things that they can walk to. Oh, we have a neighborhood store, we have a neighborhood restaurant, we have a neighborhood. And then, if somebody lives in another square, then that's their neighborhood. And what's kind of nice about that is a pattern language of, like, sort of a cluster. Instead of looking at everything being clustered in, like, one large growth, where then the parking gets out of hand, and, people are living too far from that. If you can break the zoning down so that there's, like, a cluster within each walkable, say, 10-block area, so that you can drive and then walk to all that, and then if you want to go to the next spot, maybe you can get to that spot. Because that's what happens in Somerville or Cambridge.
So, just an interesting tidbit, every house in Somerville is within 1,000 feet of a commercial district.
Right.
And they're doing pretty well. The only thing I would say is you need to test a little bit how many rooftops, how many houses you need to support a commercial district of a certain size. Because if you don't build enough density around that commercial core, it can't support the retail that's there. But I do love that. Like, that is one of the things that makes Somerville.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at San Francisco, in neighborhoods like that, that's what makes the neighborhoods so great. There's so many neighborhoods within that one city, and yet they break down into smaller, walkable, livable areas. I'm not saying we should build a place like San Francisco that, but just so that each area, if you're going to build, I mean, if we're just talking about Mashpee Commons, you know, I mean, definitely if it's going to develop the way it is, it needs to have some more green space, because it's kind of lacking in that at the moment.
So, I've got a question I want to bring up that kind of hit on both these. I'll come right back to you afterwards. This integration of land use and transportation is pretty important. And now Somerville is an entirely different animal compared to where we are here in the Cape. But how is the commission thinking about how this kind of shift in land use and activity centers will connect with the regional transportation issues, seasonal and otherwise?
Right. Well, certainly transportation is an issue, and pedestrian and bike ped kind of accommodations is something that we've really tried to focus on in these activity centers. So making sure that was incorporated into the discussions around where these activity centers should be. And then, you know, the traffic conversation, the transportation network on the Cape is a difficult conversation to have. And I know you have a whole focus at your next talk around transportation, but sometimes slow-moving traffic through activity centers is, slow-moving traffic through activity centers is positive. So we're trying to, there's a balance between what's positive and what's negative for additional impacts and transportation roadways. We have 7 million people that come across those bridges annually, so that's a lot of people to accommodate. And how can we best do that given the constraints that we have?
Yeah. So, we'll come
I
back to
just
your
wanted to say that I enjoyed this presentation. It shows different areas. But the areas that you've shown us were well-established neighborhoods. And as I was trying to visualize them in terms of transportation and roads and highways, it was not as complex, and all I can see now is that Mashpee Rotary and 151 and 28, which I travel frequently. And that's my problem. And I agree with Marge, I'd like to see all of Mashpee and see the impact of what can happen here. Because you cannot ignore that Rotary, which is the hub of people coming down 151. Mashpee is a center. You have everyone coming and going from Mashpee, which I did not see in the other areas that you presented. So I think Mashpee has a big problem, and I think that has to be addressed in terms to have open spaces or what type of housing, is multiple dwelling or whatever. So I agree with her that we have to see the entire neighborhood. And Somerville is well established. We don't have the communities that you were mentioned, you know, in different areas. So we need to see the whole picture before.
So let me try something real quick. I don't know how this is going to go, but how many people drove here in less than 5 minutes? Okay, less than 10 minutes. Less than 2 minutes. Okay, but then it's that. Well, so
If you ask a question in the summer,
that 5-minute drive. That 5-minute drive is kind of an interesting
But in
spot.
the summertime, it does not be 5 minutes. I went to
No, I agree. But I want to go back to something Kristy said about the slow-moving traffic. I want to make sure that we should dig into that a little bit more. What does that mean for a place like Mashpee or Rutland Road? And what is that? You know, and I think this has to do with character of place as well. It's how do you experience driving as a local, as a tourist, and how does a lot of folks talk about traffic as cholesterol. You have bad cholesterol and good cholesterol. And slow-moving traffic in a sort of activity center is a good thing. It's good cholesterol, right? So how is that sort of thinking? Can you expand on that a little?
Yeah, well, I think anytime you can provide accessible avenues for people to get to your area, your activity center, and you can provide an opportunity to get off of that main road that you're on and get onto a side road where you can find what you're looking for and it's easily accessible. Typically, you don't want someone that's driving 60 miles an hour through your core activity center in your area. And so, not only is it's safer for the people driving, but it's safer for those pedestrians and bicyclists that will also be in that area. So, while there may be some congestion isn't always a bad thing in some of the centers of activity.
Yeah.
I would say everything we're doing in Somerville is redevelopment. So you're right, like everything we touch has been developed in some way. And that is a very different situation than what you're looking at here. But one thing that is very similar is that most of our neighborhoods, Davis Square probably being the most significant, has a vast number of people who are crossing through it going somewhere else. Who aren't stopping to use our stores, but are because of the nature of the, I don't know, cowpath New England way that our community has been built, they need to cross through it to get from point A to point B, sometimes which aren't even in Somerville. Union Square is even more significant. I mean, probably more than half the traffic going through Union Square, where we're trying to do our most significant redevelopment right now, are people driving from Medford and points north to Cambridge. We're just cutting on through. And my goal in life is to slow them down. Either to push them back on I-93 because I slowed them down so much they went back to the highway, or to slow them down enough that maybe they might actually stop at one of our stores or something. So, you know, it becomes a challenge. It's definitely a challenge. The issue we have, though, you know, I say this all the time in Somerville because we have a lot of conversation about housing growth in Somerville, and a lot of us in the planning office see Somerville as well positioned to generate housing growth because of the location we have and the walkability we have. A lot of others in our community are sort of like, well, we've kind of done that. You know, we're the densest city in New England. We don't need more housing. But at the same time, at this point with where our regional housing market is, for every unit we don't build, someone's building something 25 miles away from us that probably is taking that person. And then they're driving through our community every day to get somewhere anyway. And they're congesting our roads and they're not living in our community. And at this point, I've kind of said, I'd rather have them here than have them sitting on the highway generating pollution driving through and not here. And if I can do that, if I can push them into a walkable core, you know, again, not everybody, but the ones who want to be there, if I can put them in a walkable core, they can probably generate all their non-work trips by walking to all of the places they need to go to. And then they're just really going out to work and back driving, or maybe on transit. And I can kind of control that a little bit better.
So we didn't touch on it in this discussion so far, but previous talks, we've talked a lot about the regional housing projects on the Cape, and that they're a little bit different dynamic here. And I think, looking at the number of building types that George showed, it seems like a lot of those we're not building on the Cape. But from what your office has done a lot of research on this, are those the types of units we need? Are those the types of kind of missing middle, as we talked about before, that it's not here?
Well, 93, I think, % of our housing stock is single-family homes. So some have said, we don't need to build another single-family home on the Cape, but we do have that missing middle. We have that. We have very few multifamily units. We have very few small number of square footage units, and so there's definitely need for those types of units and those types of different variety of diversity of housing. Not only housing types and housing styles, but housing accommodations of different types of buildings. So yes, I think that the Cape could accommodate different styles of housing and smaller units.
So I think it's that choice of being able to go from a size standpoint, but also a lifestyle change and all of that. We're interested in saying, how can we accommodate more of that? And I think that's, how do we, that's a discussion that we need to tease out more.
I think it's an important piece too to have that distinction on the life stage housing, and a lot of the units that some of the younger people are interested in. We also have seniors that are interested in similar types of housing units. So there's an evolution of housing these days.
So,
first of all, I'd like to thank the two speakers. However, this is my third meeting that you've presented. And it seems like we started with this being all of Mashpee and everyone coming together. So that's why I brought my family here, because we own a large tract of land, to see how we could become part of this conversation. However, it seems like now we're evolving around Mashpee Commons again. So how do we all join in on this conversation? How do we all become a part of the growth of this area? And that's, so basically I'm asking, what's the direction this is going in? Because it seems to kind of sidetrack.
No, I think that's a good process question, and Tony's going to kill me for doing this, but we're going to announce very soon a sort of a week-long series of events where we're actually going to draw everything we've been talking about and try and physically plan the expansion. And I think there's been a lot of questions about what does all of this look like and how does that, how do we start to realize some of these things we've been talking about? So
I think from this meeting, people must be under the assumption that we're just speaking about Mashpee Commons.
Well,
And I think that should be, I mean, that's my view.
Can I just address that? You know, I'm Mary Wagan, I'm the chair of the planning board. So this is a privately sponsored public meeting, in a sense. It's not something the town has called. Okay, I just want to be clear that it's not the town that's called this.
Like I stated, this is my third meeting. I was just asking,
No, I think it's a good question because it's
a great question.
as we've talked before, integrating the community's vision for the future of Mashpee Commons is an important aspect of it. So this is really a ground-up sort of process for how do we shape the expansion of Mashpee Commons. So how do you start to engage in that more? In the beginning of May, we'll be 22 Market Street. Is that right, Tom? 17 Market Street, that empty storefront. We're going to set up a temporary office there. You can come in from 9 a.m. till 10 p.m. whenever you want and see plans that we're going to be drawing and trying to put all of this together on a physical plan. And we really want your input on that, and we hope you come a couple of times. We're going to announce the schedule very soon. But the goal there is to draw a lot of this, have folks come in and tell if it's right or not right, and then redraw it and redraw it again. So over the course of that week, we'll be able to refine the plans a number of times. And ideally, that results in something that's close to what we as a community see as the future, and that's something that's feasible for Mashpee Commons to move forward with.
But how do you see that integrating with the greater area around you? That effort you're talking about?
I think the town, at a town-wide scale, that's a larger discussion. And looking if there's any elected officials. John?
I'm an elected official.
You're an elected official. Yeah, Mary, do you want to continue?
No.
I didn't want to put you on the spot. I know you are.
The planning board has been very interested in these conversations. We're so happy that everybody's engaged. We're so happy that Mashpee Commons has invited everybody in these sessions to speak. The planning board is a public body. I can't really speak for them at this point about this project because we haven't gotten to the point where we've been together, seen the final product to have a public opinion or even a vote on it. But I do expect, we meet the first and third Wednesday of the month. We've actually invited Kristy Senatori to come and give us a 101 about what the Cape Cod Commission is and what's a regional policy plan, and what our local comprehensive plan is, because we're starting to throw out all these words, and we want to make sure that the board and the public is educated. So that's where we are now. Where the charrette is going to be sometime, I believe, in early May.
May 3rd to 9th.
May 3rd to 9th, and then we see where we go. I believe that Mashpee Commons is proposing, an amendment to the bylaw, to the zoning bylaw. But that's something that we vote on at the planning board level and at town meetings. So please, everybody, stay engaged.
So we have a few hands that are popping up. This gentleman's been patient in the back there.
I have a question. Has Mashpee already designated form codes already part of its planning process? The other question I have is, if it has it taken photographs of existing structures that meet those form codes, and let's say pulled all those photographs together in a computer that you could create a model that people could tap into and see what would happen if such and such a form code was placed in a certain location?
So, as you know, there's been a master plan kind of evolving since the early 80s for Mashpee Commons. So there's a number of previous plans. We have an extensive library looking at what the Cape character is. So think will print and bring a lot of those to the May event. So I would definitely, check, we'll make sure those are all there. As far as a form-based standard, the 40B permit has a design code involved with it that's very much in line with a form-based code. So there are aspects of that you can look at. But I think very much so that these types that we see throughout New England, throughout the Cape, they're very, they're kind of the quintessential sort of New England, Cape Cod salt box. Those types of, we know we can calibrate and really know what those look like, and then we can start to show what they look like in and around Mashpee Commons. So I think that's what a big part of the event in May will be. So,
Thanks.
is that a follow-up question there? Or,
yes.
And then I know there's a few hands in the back here that will come to.
I had a question about the concept of open space. I hear a lot of people talking about open space, but I don't hear the specifics of what exactly is going to go in the open space. The reason why I'm asking is I see a lot of open space in Mashpee Commons already that has nothing to do with native plants, with pollinator gardens, with sustainability. And I'm thinking if we have more open space, is it just going to be more of the same?
I hear you. I'm going to say this is my. Sometimes I upset people in my community when I say this. I don't like the term open space because open space can mean anything from a highway berm to a concrete plaza. And some of it you can love and some of it you can hate. I mean, you can go through types of open space forever. One of the things we did in Somerville, and I haven't seen it done in another form-based code, is we actually categorized open spaces. We created the plaza, the pocket park, the neighborhood park, the regional park, and each of them had a certain amount of green space and a certain amount of native plantings and a certain amount of all of this stuff that sort of builds certain sustainability. So when you create a kind of urban retail center, you might expect a hardscape plaza there. But when you create 15 houses around an open space, you probably want that to be a green with trees. And so you create, and what we did is we tried to say, all right, within development areas, we wanted a mix of these open spaces to make sure that some of them were more green and some of them provided more places for people to hang out and public seating. And we put rules about, we're Somerville, we regulate things, that's what we do. We put rules about how much seating you have, about how much planting you have, about how many trees you have. Got a little pushback from the development community about the tree standards. There's too many trees, we're going to block the retail storefronts. But we did all these studies on what to do, and we packed them into these open space types to tell people, okay, if you have to do an open space as part of your project, you got to pick from this list. And that way we're no longer talking about people saying, oh, I got a couple of strips of berms behind the parking lot, I can count that as my percentage of open space now. And we all look in a kind of disappointed way and say, that's not really what we meant when we created the rule to have a certain percentage of open space.
Yes, there's two ladies in the back there, so why don't you first say?
Yeah, the thing that has concerned me most about both of the presentations is you seem to be bringing up a lot of examples and comparing us to cities, whether in Livermore, California, or Lowell, or Somerville. This is not a city, and I don't think anybody here wants Mashpee to become a city, but this form-based code process seems to be something of a tool for developers. And let's face it, and it's been made clear, that these meetings are sponsored by developers who want to see Mashpee developed. And they want to see our zoning regulations relaxed so that it makes it easier. And these are terms that came right out of the presentation. Let's make life easier for developers. Why the heck would we do that? Why would we want to change our regulations? So what's the benefit for us? We know there's a great benefit for Mashpee Commons because Mashpee Commons will get to grow and continue to grow according to this form base so that they can be the city of Mashpee. Is that really what we want?
And where it is right now, the majority of Mashpee residents who live here year-round can't afford to shop in the Commons. So you guys are talking about...
Or don't welcome in the Commons.
You guys are talking about increasing the, good cholesterol of traffic in a Commons area when the majority of us don't shop in the commons area. It's not good cholesterol for us. We're still leaving town for it.
And one more thing to add to that, is all of these additional residences that are added, is any consideration being given to the additional schools we're going to need to build?
So
Is that another
meeting? We've got a couple of questions there, so what, Kristy, do you want to take the?
I'll take the first part of your question, and our focus is really comprehensive planning. So our jurisdiction spans all 15 communities, and that's what we're looking at. The areas that we are looking at as activity centers are actually a very small portion of what is, Cape Cod. And so we're looking at those open spaces. We're looking at all those TRANSECT areas in between, and those activity centers, like I said, are a very small portion of that larger comprehensive planning effort. So I think from the Commission's perspective, certainly Mashpee is one of those 15 communities that we're looking at comprehensive planning and trying to assist at the local level, and how we can work with communities to make sure that the building and the development that is being planned in the future is responsible, and it fits into the context of not only that community but the region as a whole. So it's not just a small focused look from where we sit. It's a larger comprehensive plan.
Let me take this from a slightly, let me take a step back for a moment here, right? I'm a public sector planner by my day job, so I do my best to represent the community that I live in. I came down here to present tonight only because Russ asked me to, and we've been professional colleagues for years, so I'm just providing a perspective. And one of the things I think that's the most important perspective to provide, and I say this with my public sector planner hat on, is at the end of the day, zoning ordinance in your community is controlled by 2/3 votes of your town, not by any developer in town. And that's the residents here who are allowed to vote in town meeting, and so you control that. So at the end of the day, it's really up to you to decide whether you as a community want to vote a zoning change or don't want to vote a zoning change. I mean, that's a key issue here. I think that my understanding is one of the reasons the folks in Mashpee Commons want to do this, one of the obvious reasons, is because they want to seek the opportunity to say, we would like to change some things in zoning so that we can do things here that our zoning doesn't currently allow us to do. My perspective is, if I were sitting here as a community member, I would be asking a couple of key questions, one of which I think you just asked, which is essentially about the fiscal impacts of it. I know that it tends to be that smaller housing units don't generate that many school kids, but there are people out there that can test that, you can study that, you can take a look at that, and you can kind of figure out whether or not there is a net fiscal benefit for new development to you. Is there, at the end of the day, does it generate more taxes to the community than the services that it draws from the community? And if so, what do you do with that? For better or worse, in Massachusetts, we're a slave to new growth, where the Proposition 2.5 property tax caps, unless you want to go vote overrides, really depends upon new growth as the way to keep up with the services that your community has. Because honestly, since Prop 2.5 passed in the early 1980s, the reality of the world is that inflation of municipal costs has gone up substantially faster than the 2.5% that you can tack onto each tax bill every year to be able to keep up with it. And there are two options to get out of that. One is new growth and the other is the override. And the key on new growth is making sure that the new growth you built doesn't generate more demands on the town than before you built it, right? It doesn't, if you build housing and it brings in $500,000 in taxes, but it brings in 75 school kids, it's not going to work. So my perspective as a planner is that there are environmental and economic benefits of looking at concentrating new growth in areas that have existing infrastructure, have the ability to handle it, and have the possibility to be able to say, okay, I can do net positive benefit growth. Building single-family homes on 2-acre lots till the end of time is probably not your way out of fiscal challenges. Mixed-use walkable development does it better. Now, it's again up to all of you to decide if you think that Mashpee Commons or someone else or something else or nothing else or what you want to do to get there. But I guess having been in this field in Massachusetts for a while, What I find myself doing is chasing the type of new growth that fits the character of the community I have and makes it work in a way that works. So,
Can I follow up?
yeah, go ahead, sure.
So, what you're telling me makes sense, and I'm smart enough to understand that.
Sure.
But at the same time, what we're raising the BS flag here is that Mashpee Commons wants to do this and create all these additional units, but the whole reason for changing the zoning is so that they don't have to put in the affordable housing as they're supposed to.
Boom.
Drop the
Fact.
mic. I mean, what?
I don't think that's characterized properly. What
We
the
have this,
conversation around
that's fact,
housing
we
we
already
had a
had
few
this
weeks
discussion.
ago, we're going to
last meeting.
expand on in May. And I think the conversation that Mashpee Commons has brought forward is that we need to provide a spectrum of affordable options. And right now, the reality is we're not building any more housing up Market Street for the, in the long term. So there's going to be no more affordable housing built. So I think we want to come back to the community and say we
By
want to
Mashpee
continue.
Commons, there'll be no more.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So how do we continue to build housing, provide affordable housing through that growth, as well as many other housing
Yes,
needs?
show me how you're going to do that.
We need to figure that out. That's,
No, there's regulations, that's what we have, regulations that,
so, hold on, so I know, Miss, you've been very patient in the back, and you're kind of going to jump over the audience here in a second, so why don't you ask?
Well,
Yeah, please go ahead.
well, I find it interesting because I'm hearing all these perspectives, and I'm actually new to Mashpee Commons, but I'm not new to Cape Cod. I was in Hyannis house, I lived in a home in Hyannis, then in an apartment, and recently moved to Mashpee, in an affordable unit. And it's fabulous, so I need to say that. But I do understand what they're saying. There has to be a relationship building that is not happening between, and I'll tell you, I've been on Cape Cod. I know where the Main Street is in Falmouth. Obviously, I know the Main Street in Hyannis, Orleans, Katuick. I have no idea. I've been here 30 years. I have no idea where the Main Street in Mashpee is.
Route 130.
Thank you, but it's not a drawing for people, I don't think. And I may be missing it because I'm not 100% sure why. Everyone comes to the Commons from all of these other towns. I don't know if that's a good thing, bad thing, but me, as a new resident of Mashpee, I want to know where Main Street is. I want to know the historic value of everyone who's coming here. Like, I heard what you said, and it really drew me in. Like, we need that relationship. We can't just be, I don't want Mashpee Commons to be this like gated community where, someone said they can't afford it, or don't shop here. And it's like, what is that relationship building from that perspective?
You can't meeting by saying it's a private meeting when I get invited to come.
No,
That's not fair either.
Not to mention,
we
you guys
never
are
said it was a
using,
private meeting.
you guys are-
I didn't mean to imply that. I just wanted
No,
you
you just
to
wanted to
know that you're not in a room where the planning board is on a dais and convene.
No, well, it was
So,
that. And
you'll see that
it
sometimes-
should be an open dialogue for everyone to come here
How-
and state that.
We're
You
trying to make this as open as possible.
And I feel you have, and I really
And
do
if
feel you have.
you have ideas for how we can make it more open and more integrated, please come grab me after the session, let's talk about it more, because we're planning the day.
I've spoken to you one-on-one.
No, I understand, Miss in the back.
Yes.
You brought up how we can make this a more genuine discussion, and
Yes.
we should talk about that more afterwards. How do we do that?
Right.
That's part of the process here is how do we make this a whole conversation?
Yes.
Because, how many people visit Mashpee Commons once a week? Mashpee Commons is a weekly, involved. So why are we asking you this? It's because everyone comes to Mashpee Commons. We want to make sure that the community still is proud of it. And the community, as it grows, provides things for the community that are important. So these are important
But I think it can draw itself to the historic site of, like I say, I do not know where Main Street, say Mashpee Commons wasn't here. I have no idea where really Main Street is in Mashpee. I truly don't. I've been on Cape 30 years. I don't know why that is. I mean, I might be naive, but that's what I'm saying. Why was that? why
Been
wasn't?
there for 4,000
Right,
years.
right, why wasn't, and maybe we don't want to develop it, I'm not saying that, but there has to be some respect for all of that.
I understand, and I think we're focused on what we can, what we control and what we can do with that, and how, and what's feasible. I think if the town was to have a larger discussion about what happens in other places, that's the discussion that could emerge out of this. So,
But
that's not our, you know, that's
No, it's not
not part of our
necessarily your responsibility either, but I'm saying it's your responsibility to have that relationship with the town.
Yeah.
And I love Mashpee Commons, like I said, I live here, so I love it.
So, I know I want to be cognizant of everyone's evening, so we're getting kind of late. Could I welcome the speakers for any closing thoughts or comments? Kristy, George?
No, I think this has been a very thoughtful process, and I would commend Mashpee Commons for having these meetings and really opening up the conversation, and I think these are important conversations. The community context is important, and I think that this has been very informative for our planning processes too. So.
I see these conversations in every town in New England, and I give, and every place is unique, and they're all struggling with these issues in the same way. So I urge everybody here to come into whatever process is going on next and kind of take the perspective with an open mind and sort of see where things are going. And at the same time, consider kind of, you know, where and what, certainly where and what you want the commons to be, because that's certainly what is the topic of that particular charrette and the stuff going forward in May. But also to put it in the perspective of how it fits in the rest of the community and what it can do for the community or not do for the community and how that can happen. And understand that, you know, you have an opportunity to help work to guide the crafting of zoning that will eventually reach town meeting. I mean, that's essentially what it is. And figure out a way to make sure that the community's values and intent and everything related to it remain there as it relates to Mashpee Commons and the circumstances there. And then if there are other pieces, you know, I can't tell you what to do about things that, you know, a lot of discussions seem to be venturing to topics in the rest of the town, but my suggestion is just, you know, if you get a lot of people together and you're talking a lot about it, keep on doing that, because that's how you make sure to protect what you love about a place and make it work.
Great. Well, thank you, Kristy and George, for your